do we actually need new oral therapies? And so these are my disclosures. All the slides are mine and reflect my idea or some controversial ideas behind it. So if you think about psoriasis therapy, and you heard a lot today, you always have to find for every single patient that treatment which offers the best balance between efficacy on one side and benefit on one side, and as little risk and inconvenience on the others. And for that, you obviously have to be as targeted as possible, but at the same time also as broad as needed. So that sometimes can be a challenge, and we heard quite a bit over the first talks in the first part as well. So if you think about the treatment choice, there's a lot of factors weighing in. So there's obviously efficacy and safety being important. We heard about coal tar being still used, despite the fact that it has some side effects and other tolerability and convenience issues. That has an effect on the compliance and so on. You have patient-related factors, but also have the disease-related factors. Now, what's the phenotype? We heard a lot about the first part again. What are the activity? What do you really want to target? And sometimes a very targeted therapy might not be optimal. That also means it's not one size fits all. So not even one single class of therapy is probably sufficient to treat all our patients. But nevertheless, if you look at that, the biologics seem pretty good in that regard. I mean, ticking off on most of these factors. However, if you look at the data, and now I can actually tell us to your point of view, I mean, there's only 15% or even less percent of patients actually receiving systemic therapy. And among these, you can see that the vast majority are not receiving any biologics. So it's still the conventional therapies which remain the absolute first-line treatment option and the most broadly used in our patients. And this is neither, what do you say, East Germany in the 80s, nor a third world country. This is actually France and data from the Netherlands. So it still holds true that these therapies still remain widely used. And that is mainly not to the fact that they're very effective and very safe. So their efficacy and safety profile is not as good as the biologics, but it's just from the point of view from their efficiency principle, they're very cheap. So you have to get access to these drugs. They are widely used, and this is particularly cyclosporine and methotrexate in some countries, particularly also here in Netherlands, and in Germany, fumaric acid, but I think in the other countries, mostly cyclosporine, particularly methotrexate, which are widely used. And they have their benefits. I mean, if you look at cyclosporine, and we're talking about efficacy, that is really up there with the biologics. For us in Switzerland, at least, it's really a short-term control in emergency drug for like 3 to 4 months, and we'll get off it because of the safety profiles. The Italians are a bit more courageous. They go on for about 2 years, but then it also eventually stops. But what's interesting is, again, I said you have to be as targeted as possible, but also as wide or broadly as needed. It is very effective in also various phenotypes. Here, for example, in one of our cases from Lausanne with a rather severe palmoplantar pustulosis, and even 2 weeks later, he is probably 90% better, and all the pustules just disappeared. And also methotrexate, very solid drug, very solid efficacy, maybe not as high as cyclosporine, obviously, but you have a long-term control. Both of them work nicely on other phenotypes, including nail psoriasis. Methotrexate a bit better concerning the matrix, and cyclosporine a bit better on the nail side, on the bad nail side. However, those therapies have their limitations, and that is mainly due to long-term control, side effects, drug interactions. They have real contraindications, so that makes them not optimal in that regard of what you want to have in a therapy. So again, you want to be as targeted as possible, going back to that. And it's like we know for years and years now that this pathway of TNF, IL-23 and IL-17 is absolutely critical in plaque type psoriasis, and this has led also to the development of treatments targeting this pathway. And Michel Gier has already shown a very similar slide, a project that he launched some 6-7 years ago in Lausanne, showing these expression profiles. You can see in red overexpression and green absence, and you can see that all the psoriasis with unbiased clustering are going together. Then you can also see that psoriasis is really a Th17-driven disease. There's a bit of interferon in some, there's a little bit of, I'm not sure if the pointer is working, yeah it does, there's a little bit of neutrophilic in some, you have a little bit of injury in the others, but in the end it is clear-cut a Th17-driven disease. And this, again, as mentioned, has led to the development of these targeted therapies with a huge success, with particularly 17 and 23 blockers now so effective that we're stratifying our patient on such a high level that we hardly have any patients actually who do not respond. So getting back to that a little bit, do we really need oral therapies? And I mean, the biologics have dominated the field of targeted systemic therapies, getting away from the conventional ones, not just in psoriasis, but in all immunology brutally. I mean, they have mega blockbusters like Humira and Dupixent in this indication, and in psoriasis we've pushed so hard that really PASI 90 and PASI 100 have become the benchmark. On the other hand, we have the targeted oral therapies. In psoriasis, there would be deucravacitinib and apremilast, as we heard as well. It's also on topical, but they don't pass actually the 15%. So, and this is not just in psoriasis. This is in AD, this is in psoriatic arthritis, in ulcerative colitis, and if you think about Crohn's disease, that's not even passing 5%. That's 95% of the patients receiving biologics. So despite the fact that all the papers that are out there that the patients actually prefer orals, it's more convenient, we don't want injections, there's fear of needles and so on, they cannot pass that. The question remains, so why do we not get there? And one obvious response here is the efficacy and safety profile or tolerability. So they're solidly effective to deucravacitinib and apremilast, but they're really far away from what we get in the biologics. So if you think about the different approaches that we have, and we heard it much better actually from you, and you should come up here and explain that. You can do that much better than I can. So the small molecules, that's what we have classically. Chemical production of development of drugs, such as aspirin being the first one, has a very high bioavailability, but it is very non-specific or very low selectivity and specificity. It has therefore also off-target effects and toxicity. You have lots of drug-drug interactions, so there's the limitation that we have. On the other hand, we have the monoclonal antibodies, which are highly specific, highly potent, because we have these efficacies that we see in them. However, there's literally no oral bioavailability because they're just literally destroyed in the stomach. So you cannot have the benefit of having an oral. And in between, we have these oral peptides or peptide therapeutics in the range of about 5 kilodaltons. They're highly selective, highly potent, but they would have to overcome the problem that there's a low oral bioavailability. There's like GI stability is very, very low, so you have to modify a peptide that it actually passes into the system. And then you would have the combination a bit of both, that you have an efficacy close to the monoclonal antibodies, but having an oral. And that is actually not so new. So the oral peptides have been now a bit everywhere in every presentations, but this is nothing new. Methotrexate being a classical small molecule, and we have cyclosporine, which actually is a peptide, a small oral cyclic peptide of 11 amino acids. Problem is there is still not so specific. There's a lot toxicity, there's drug-drug interaction, so it's not your drug that you dream of. But there are these type of drugs which are now mega blockbusters. Obviously, the GLP-1 agonists that we have on the market now, great for diabetes, but a huge blockbuster, obviously, in weight loss. So that's why a lot of companies now actually push the market in that regard and actually develop, particularly in that regard, a lot of new drugs. However, there's no drug so far actually in that range that is indicated for immunological diseases. So that's what we stand, and you showed almost the same picture before. So we have this huge success with the targeted monoclonal antibodies. We had one PD4 inhibitor, one TYK2 inhibitor with moderate success, as mentioned, not passing this 15%. And if you look into the future, you can see where the monoclonal antibody is getting a bit thinner. So it seems like these low-hanging fruits are gone. There's not one single cytokine left that we can target. Misha Gia this morning mentioned about IL-26, which might be an interesting candidate and so on. But other than that, it's not really anything there that you can just easily pick. There are biosimilars obviously coming, making another pressure on new drugs which will enter the market, including orals. There's new approaches with an extremely extended half-life. So we have Oruka, for example, which has a drug coming with this once yearly injection with an efficacy similar, seems like, to risankizumab. So you get one injection per year and have that effect. Again, pressure on the orals or anything else because that is really convenient. So other approaches that are still a bit further away, but there might be bi or multi-specific antibodies. So you block 23-17 and combine it with another one, be it another cytokine, but also could be Tregs or something that has an effect on the tissue. Novel targets, as mentioned, is probably a bit less interesting. But if you look at the orals, there's a huge movement there. So there's lots of TYK2 inhibitors that will be developed. I think 8 or 9 are currently in clinical development. PD4 inhibitors are being developed, IL-23 inhibitor, oral one, IL-17, and newer targets such as sphingosine-1 receptor, which actually was done already 15 years ago by Actelion, but then failed. So it's going to be interesting to see if these approaches, as also adenosine A3 receptor agonists, if they are actually effective in the treatment, really can enter the market, but we'll see. But it seems like there's a lot of production, a lot of development there. So the question really still remains, as I mentioned a bit in the Wayne Galloway, why would we need oral therapies? I mean, there's not much reason for it. I mean, obviously, we say there's no need for orals. Patients prefer oral therapies. It's more convenient. But again, one injection once a year is pretty convenient as well. Flexibility, obviously an issue. So that would be interesting for the orals. Then the other would be that if you have a better accessibility, so you lower the price, the patient will get access to it. But again, these are not coming onto the market for $200-300 US per year. These are in the range of the biologics, maybe a bit lower. Biosimilars might be even cheaper. So why do companies actually produce them? And one thing is actually the shareholder pressure. They have to have something in the pipeline, and they have to show something new. They're not so much judged by what they have currently, but what is coming. And obviously, as I said, the low-hanging fruits in the biologics are gone, so they move to the orals, and there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of options there. So what can be done? So one option would be you do something similar to what we have with the biologics. So you're very, very targeted. You block the 23-17, and you just do it orally and find a drug which has an excellent efficacy safety profile. And the one which is by far the most advanced is Icotrokinra from J&J. So this is a first-in-class, really a first as is, with a cyclic peptide which has a GI stability. So it gets into the system and binds then the IL-23 receptor with a very high affinity. So it is in the range of a single-digit picomolar affinity. So this is approaching the biologics. It's still far away, but we're getting there slowly, and then blocks actually IL-23 signaling. Other approaches that are being tested by several companies actually allosteric binding of the IL-17A, so the two heterodimers can still get together, but they cannot bind to the receptor. Then this is also in early clinical development or even preclinical development. As mentioned, by far most advanced is ICO, and the data actually look really solid. I mean, this becomes now very interesting. You can see PASI 75, 90, and 100, 80%, 65, and 40%. That's what we know from the IL-17 blocker. So this is in the range of secukinumab and ixekizumab. And you can see it's not even plateaued yet. So this goes up, still further up. So it's going to be interesting to see what the long term is. A bit the drawback is it takes some time. I mean, the biologics are really fast. Here we're at 24 weeks, and you can see it takes these 3, 4 to 6 months till you have this efficacy. So you're going to see you have a daily drug that you have to take. That is a slower onset than we have with the biologic. So we're going to see if this really takes away patients from the biologic. But this is an interesting doc, that's for sure. So this picture is seen by Michel Gier before already. So this is plaque-type psoriasis, but psoriasis is not just plaque-type psoriasis. There are also other subtypes. The acute forms of psoriasis, including erythrodermic psoriasis, and then obviously the pustular forms of psoriasis, which are a bit driven by different inflammation. And again, Michel has shown that before. So you can see plaque-type psoriasis really being Th17. Then some of them have an overlap, but the acute ones then also mainly driven by interferon or the combination. And then you have the neutrophilic signature IL-36, including in the pustular ones. So again, similar figures before. So you have these acute forms. I did not include paradoxical psoriasis here, but you have this unstable. It's a question I think, Louis, you had before. So you have the PDCs and the interferon in the periphery and Th17 and the T cells in the middle. So you have not just interferon, but you also have Th17. So you have two pathways being active at the same time. And as Michel also nicely shown, these resistant psoriasis, where you also find Th17 and interferon at the same time. So it seems like sometimes you can be too specific by just blocking one pathway, just blocking one cytokine with a biologic. And we have the option actually already to where we block both cytokines or pathways simultaneously. There's a TYK2 inhibitor, deucravacitinib, which blocks simultaneously type 1 interferon and IL-23. And this is done. I mean, TYK2 is a JAK, and JAK have gone a bit under scrutiny, JAK inhibitors, but it's mainly due to the fact that the first generation JAKs, or all the JAK inhibitors which block JAK 1, 2, 3, are actually binding at the highly conserved domain over here, which is the ATP binding domain, and they competitively bind against the ATP, and so there's always an overlap. There's always a lack of specificity, no matter how you do it. On the other hand, what deucravacitinib does and the other allosteric ones, they bind actually here at the regulatory domain, which is highly specific for all the different JAKs, so JAK 1, 2, 3, and TYK2, and therefore that is a highly targeted, very specific TYK2 inhibition. And this actually translates into a very solid efficacy. So you can see here again, PASI 75, 90, and 100, about 60, 40, and 19%, but we're not in the range of the biologics yet. It has a decent side effect profile, not a lot. I mean, you block interference, you do see some viral reactivation, but other than that, there's not a lot. But we're not there with the biologics, so it's difficult to actually get these drugs really taking away market shares from the biologic. And again, you can see it takes some time with oral, so you get the plateau about at 6 months. So again, it takes a bit of time till the effect. So can we optimize this? And this is data from zasocitinib, so another TYK2 inhibitor, which is now entering phase 3 trials. And you can actually see, so deucravacitinib is blocking the IL-23 pathway not so effectively. And it blocks the interferon pathway actually pretty neatly. So this effect is in a similar range than what we see from the JAK inhibitors, but Saso is clearly more effective in that way. But both of them do not have the JAK 1, 2, 3 inhibition, so it does not have this side effect profile. So how does that translate that you block actually pretty well these two pathways? And these are early data, some phase 2 trial from zasocitinib, and what you can see is it's after 12 weeks. They do not have any longer data, so it's very early on, but you can see this is 60, 40, and 30%. 60, 40 does sound not much more than before, but again, it is week 12, so this is still going up. But what's interesting is this 30% of PASI 100. So 1 out of 30 patients at 3 months has actually a PASI 100. Again, this is phase 2 data, but this looks promising, and this might be an interesting doc going forward. On the other hand, we have GPP, or the pustular psoriasis. There we know that this pathway that activates the NF-kappa B MAP kinase pathway, particularly IL-36, plays a role, and this made this IL-36 receptor antagonist an interesting target, and spesolimab is now on the market, in some countries at least, for GPP, 1P is sufficient. And what you can see is really the pustules just melt away within hours, or at least 1 or 2 days. The erythema takes so often a bit more. But GPP remains really rare, and we heard a bit before about palmoplantar pustular psoriasis being a different entity, but nevertheless, could 36 blockade actually work, and that was a failure. So why can be something that is so effective on the pustule actually fail in palmoplantar pustular psoriasis? And if you look at the gene expression, it explains that as well. So you have Th17 in all of them, so plaque type psoriasis, PPP, and GPP. On top, you have the neutrophilic signature in GPP, but in palmoplantar pustular psoriasis, you on top have a Th1 signature, at least in some of them. You also find a lot of type 1 interferon as well. So it's not just one pathway, but actually several pathways being active, and that's why a lot of drugs actually fail in, or targeted drugs fail in palmoplantar pustular psoriasis. And that's why, at least for in our hands, the drug that we mostly use is apremilast, which is like the weakest oral targeted therapy that we have for plaque type psoriasis, or lacks the most efficacy. But it has a broad effect, and it blocks both Th1, Th17, but also the neutrophil activation, migration, and also netosis. So you have this broad effect on everything, and it actually works pretty well in palmoplantar pustular psoriasis as well. There are newer drugs being developed, newer PDE4 inhibitors being more potent, being more specific, and they show higher efficacy, it seems. However, there might be a limitation with the tolerability, because also the GI side effects actually are increased in comparison to apremilast. Again, we'll have to see if these drugs are really well received by the patients. So in summary, so we have these pathways in psoriasis. You've seen a similar graphic from Michel Gier before. So we have chronic plaque type psoriasis really driven by this Th17, IL-23 pathway. We have the acute inflammation, type 1 interferon being prominent, and the pustular with the neutrophilic signature, IL-31, IL-1 being there. And we do have actually targeted and not so targeted therapies for these options. And depending if you're really at the corner of the triangle or somewhere in between, you might want to be more targeted or not. It's going to be interesting to see where actually the orals fit in. The new TYK2 inhibitors, which are more specific, sounds very interesting. PDE4 depends on the tolerability, but again, on the IL-23 blockers, which looks very, very interesting. But it's going to be interesting to see how patients actually react to that they have to take a daily pill, have to wait for 6 months for having the efficacy. In contrast to the newer drugs which are approaching, I think it might be that actually the companies have to create a need for these drugs again. And here for this figure, shout out to Jennifer Ngo is in the audience. She's an IPC fellow now in our lab, and she actually found the picture, and I really liked it. I mean, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because it's coming from a commercial company, but it gives you a bit of an idea where we came from with orals and where we're going. So this is apremilast and tucravacitinib, and then here are icacotrinra and socitinib. So the orals really are approaching the biologics. They even bypass here. There's ustekinumab, adalimumab, and the 17 blockers. So we're really getting into the range. They're really closing the gap versus the biologics concerning PASI 100 response. So as a summary, with all the drugs that are there, the oral conventional therapies, just because of the costs, remain the absolute first-line systemic treatment option for the majority of our patients. Can say unfortunately, because their safety and efficacy profile is clearly inferior. If you remove the cost effectiveness, then most probably everyone will be on a targeted therapy. And the novel targeted therapies, they face quite a lot of challenges, to be honest. Not just getting the bioavailability and so on, but there's a lot of crowding probably going to be there, because there's a lot of orals that are being currently developed, and that leads to both intra but also intra class competition. As I mentioned, there are like 8 TYK2 inhibitors which are currently developed. There's a generics coming from apremilast. There are biosimilars with ustekinumab and secukinumab are looming over the next few years. They will drop the cost again, and will make pressure that we use those instead of actually the potentially even more expensive orals. And then there's new novel biologics coming, as mentioned, like the Uruca one, which has the once-yearly injection that are extremely convenient. So that's going to be another pressure. Now, as I mentioned before, it's maybe a little bit like the Nescafé or Nespresso story. When Nestle came onto the market with Nespresso, it was a complete failure, and they almost took it off the market again. And they said, okay, we'll invest one more time a lot of money in, do a lot of PR and create a need for it. And it became a huge success story. And I think that's probably what the company's going to have to do to really get those drugs onto the market and have a huge success with it, because we are, at least the dermatologists, are got very used to the injectables. Well, first we were afraid of it, and now we're so used to it. So we're going to see how that fits and how really they're going to take a huge market share from the biologics. But nevertheless, I think for the dermatologists and for the patients, there are some in the audience, it's a super interesting time. We have all these options now at our hands and can really select our patients, stratify our patients, both clinical but also through molecular profiling, as Mr. Gia has shown in the first talk, and then decide if you really want to go for one pathway, one cytokine, be it through a biologic or the novel oral peptide therapeutics, or if you want to go for several pathways and use a more broadly small molecule drug, for example, TYK2 inhibition that unblocks several pathways, and you might get those resistant patients back to on track and being effective. And with that, I think that was my last slide. Yes, it was. And thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.